Today's podcast is brought to you by Dell Expert Network. Dell's partner outreach program is now available to Dell Expert Network members. One of Dell's partner outreach managers can come out on site and visit with you to demo the latest laptops and desktops, discuss any upcoming projects, make recommendations, and provide solutions to keep you and your customers on the cutting edge of technology. To learn more about the program, please visit www.dell.com/outreach and mention Dell Expert Network in the professional association field as you fill out the registration.
You're entering the MSP Zone, a podcast for the managed services community, covering news, analysis, and interviews from around the globe. Elevate your MSP game by staying in the MSP Zone. And now, your host, Charles Weaver.
You can't repeat what you don't document. You can put in front of that sentence any word, any noun to replace that sentence and have it apply equally, validly to almost any situation. Musicians, scientists, chefs. I thought we might use chefs as a great example of a repeatable business model that relies heavily on documentation. And that's just going to be our case study today, but it's not about cooking or the culinary arts. We're going to use that as a brief jumping off point for the managed service provider community and what I think is happening in the MSP space relative to documentation, and give you a sense of where I think we ought to be, and then how we can get there to where we ought to be. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I assure you, this is going to be, you may be thinking, oh my God, we're going to talk about documentation. This is going to be boring. No, it's not going to be boring, because when you do this, you will have incredible, and I'm not overselling this, you will have incredible things happen in your MSP business. Trust me, I have seen this. And I'm going to give you concrete examples in other sectors that will prove what I'm saying. But I've seen it happen within the MSP space. MSPs who didn't have documentation, or they had some of it, but it wasn't great. It was lacking in certain areas. And MSPs that do have it. And there are very stark differences between how those two types of MSPs operate. And I'll give you a multitude of different KPIs or benchmarks that will support that. And lastly, we're going to give you some ways that you can improve or begin your documentation. So even if you have documentation, we'll give you some methods to make it better. If you don't have much or at all documentation for your MSP business, we're going to give you some practical ways that you can start that journey and give you a goal to achieve that. Like I said before, it's going to make a world of difference in your MSP business. So let's dive right in and get started. Why? Or maybe what is the relevancy of documentation? Why do we have it? And why is it important to have documentation as an MSP? Well, let me give you the non-MSP analogy that I was working on. I was thinking about, you could apply this to musicians. You can certainly apply it to not just engineers, scientists. Scientists have copious documentation, but that's kind of maybe more sterile, analytical. I thought maybe we would respond better. Maybe you would respond better to food, right? We all eat food. Going out to dinner, most people like going out to dinner. Let's take an imaginary chef. And this chef is preparing a meal for a friend of theirs. And the chef invites the friend over, and the chef prepares a very elaborate meal. And the friends at the end of the meal says, "Wow, this tastes really good. This was fantastic. It blew me away. You should start your own restaurant." And I'd like to invite 4 friends over next week because I enjoyed this so much. I'd like to have some friends of mine come over and have you cook for them as well. So the chef says, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So dinner for 5 the next week. So the chef for that first dinner didn't write anything down, didn't have a recipe, just created stuff off the top of their head and said, I'm pretty good at what I do. So they threw some ingredients in, and they created a menu, and they just did it. And they kind of cooked by instinct, which is a really common thing. A lot of chefs, a lot of cooks, a lot of non-chefs, right? Just people who just cook by feel, cook by, they don't have precise measurements. They're just, a dash of this, a dash of that. You cut this up, chop this up. You cook this for a certain temperature at certain durations. Any of you or backyard barbecue people, that's very frequent, right? You cook by sight, by smell. You by touch. Is it done yet? Is not quite done? It's kind of an art form, right? But back to our chef example, right? Party for 5, right? Dinner party for 5. Now the chef says, "Wow, this is great. Someone appreciates my cooking." They invite some friends over. The chef starts to go through the process, and what happens? Doesn't have a starting point. Has to recall from memory the previous week. What did I do? How much did I put in there? And not just that. I cooked for one person, so all the ratios were for one person. Now I'm cooking for 5. But the chef does it. The chef pulls it out, and everybody in that party of 5 says the same thing that the person the previous week says. "Fantastic! You did such a great job. We are just blown away by how good this is. We want to recommend you to half dozen of our friends." And so the following week, the chef is now presented with the unbelievable, a good problem to have, but nevertheless a problem. They've got 60 people. The chef has 60 people to cook for. And now the chef, has a multitude of problems. One, the chef can't cook for 60 people by himself or herself. Can't do it. Impossible. Has to have help. There is no functional way to serve that many people with one person. So the chef has to bring in help. And when the chef brings in help, let's say that our imaginary chef finds that person or 2 people, 1 or 2, 2 or 3 people probably would be definitely required for 60 people. And what happens? Well, the chef has all this knowledge in their head. I know I've been cooking this stuff for 2 weeks now. This is my 3rd week. I know it pretty well, but the 2 other people don't. So the chef has to maintain quality because the people, everybody, including the original group of referrals, shall we call them, are accustomed to a certain high quality product. They're expecting that to happen. They don't know that cooking for 1 is necessarily different than cooking for 60. They just want the same thing that they had the last time. It's a reasonable request. It's a reasonable expectation. But now the chef has 2 other people, let's say, in the kitchen that now have to assist the chef in preparing 60 meals of the same quality at a far greater quantity than the chef ever has before. That is a problem of scalability. And you can take that scenario and apply it to almost any profession. You can apply it to law, you can apply it to medicine to some degree, you can apply it to engineering, you can apply it to the sciences, you can apply it to any service industry, certainly. But also to product manufacturing as well. And you can most certainly apply this to the managed service provider profession. And what I've described is the distinction between, when you break it down, the chef that cooks comfortably for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, and the chef that can cook with the same efficiency and the same high quality for 60 people or 600 people is a question of scale. The chef that cooks for 1 to 4 people is the prototypical break-fix company. They don't have repeatable process. They don't have a method for scale. They can do things one-off quite well, let's say. But they can't repeat it at a point where the one person, let's say, and it traditionally is one person. It's traditionally in break-fix organizations that I've studied over 20 plus years. It's typically that rock star. You have one person who's really good at doing it, and that person, as long as they show up for work, they're the ones that are responsible for high-quality service delivery. They're also the person that when they decide to, because they know that they control the linchpin for that service organization. They decide not to show up. They decide to take a break. They take a vacation, right? Or they decide, I don't know, they want, whatever. They just want to be a pest. If they decide not to play ball, then it can throw a service organization into a great deal of headwinds and problems because they don't have anybody else there that can do it. There are, pardon the pun, there are no other chefs in the kitchen who can step in and do the work and produce the same outcome. Why can't they do that? Well, that all boils down to one thing: documentation of a process. Now, I will say that I have seen many examples of believe it or not, I've seen many examples of MSPs who do this. I'm pretty sure that it's happened in the culinary field, where they have a repeatable process that works that isn't documented. Now, I have seen that, and you may be out there saying, yeah, that's probably my MSP business, or that's my MSP division. We've got a good group of people. We've got a good process. The customers love what we do, and we don't document anything. So, Charles, what's the beef, man? What's the problem? Well, the problem in my earlier example is when you start to scale up, right? The scenario I've just presented is everybody is of the same skill set. Everybody is of the same thing. That original example of the chef, if the chef had 4 of his friends sitting around watching the chef prepare for that one person or that group of 4 people or 5 people, observing, and then were able to step in when that group of 60 came about, the chef then didn't have to really do anything because the other people, the assistant chefs, if you want to call them that, were already read in. They already knew what the protocol was. They knew what the ingredients were. They knew the menu. They knew the plating style and the ingredients and the measurements and the cooking time and all that stuff. They didn't have to be trained, in other words. That is not the common scenario. In fact, that rarely ever happens. You typically, in most MSP organizations I've ever come across, certainly for the vast majority, 65, 75% of the MSPs on the planet are of a size where they probably have no more than one person. And if they have one person, that's something. But they have no more than one person who really understands the totality of their service delivery process enough that they could tell someone else what to do and how to do it. The good MSPs don't have to worry about that because they've got their process documented. Hence, the topic of today's episode is MSPs can't repeat what they don't document. The repeatability and scalability of an MSP business model is everything. I shouldn't have to tell you this. I think most of you probably know this, but there's a lot of new listeners out there, and there's quite a lot of new MSPs out there who haven't been around for a lot. And so you may be coming into this profession saying, I don't know where your backgrounds come from, but you just may not be privy to this information. But I'm telling you now, to be a good MSP, you have to be scalable. You can't be good at one-on-one. That doesn't cut it. That doesn't pay the bills at all. Doesn't even come close. If you can't scale what you do and keep customer number 1 happy and keep customer 100 happy at the same level, you've got a problem, and you're eventually, if you don't correct that problem, it's gonna implode. And we've seen that happen far too often. And I don't want to see any MSP practice implode like that. So I'm kind of making this a point very aggressively so that you don't miss it. Documentation is really critical if you want to scale your business. If you don't have documentation, you are going to have problems. Until you do that documentation step, you're going to be sitting in a very precarious situation with a high degree of risk and a high degree of probability that your service delivery is going to falter. We'll get to that in a moment. So back to the chef, right? So what does the chef do? The chef that wants to scale from 4 people at the dinner table to serving 60 or 600 people over the course of a night has to have a recipe, has to write down the menu so that other people in the kitchen can be aware of what the expectation is and have a guide to shepherd them, to lead them through the process, and so that it can be repeated over and over and over again with a high degree of consistency. For the MSP, just like for the chef, the importance of documentation, most people think of it as security, right? I agree, and I'm not disputing that. I'm just not talking about security today. I'm talking about scalability. And the scale, the ability to scale comes into stark contrast when you have a good process that hasn't been written down by anybody. Because when that happens, you now have an inefficient model for onboarding users. Not talking about customers, I'm talking about your own internal users, service delivery staff. You cannot onboard people using, the 2,000 years ago fireside, verbal communication model of transferring knowledge. We don't live in that era anymore, right? We're not sitting around by the campfire talking about the brontosaurus that we killed, the day before, and where we did it and how we killed it and how we cooked it and how we hunted it. No. We live in a modern, evolved society, or we'd like to think so. And so the MSP that is attempting to scale needs a mechanism to bring the uninitiated person into the organization and in as rapid a fashion as possible, bring that new hire to a point of being effective, informed about what is expected of them, and to have a measurement device, a documentation device that will measure the effectiveness of that new user according to a documented set of practices. That is if you boil it down just from the scalability thing, that is what documentation will get you. At some point, you may, and I'll admit, this applies to a fair number of MSPs. I'm not going to hazard a guess publicly about what percentage that is, but it's a fair amount. A fair amount of MSPs have a really good process. Customers like it. The MSP is profitable. Everything's happy. But because it's not written down, the moment they lose critical personnel or they onboard an attempt to grow and achieve that scale, they come into problems, significant problems. And the scale issue is going to impact your profitability. It's going to impact your customer retention. It's going to impact your referrals. If customers aren't happy, they're not going to refer you. It's going to impact your service margins because you're going to be inefficient in certain key areas. It's going to impact your bottom line. And dare I say it, it's going to impact internal morale. Your MSP service delivery team morale is going to hit a brick wall absent any documentation because they're going to realize how vulnerable the whole organization is. All right, so I've beat that to death, right? You all get why documentation is important. You get why it's important to scalability. Fine. Now you're asking, well, all right, how do we get from point A to point B? I'm going to give you the answer. The best way to document is to start small and to build as you go. And I'll jump to the end of this, which is to say documentation is not a one and done thing. If you think that this is like, oh, I can go online and buy some templates. You know, I've seen these things out there all the time. We have templates, right? Templates only get you so far. Documentation is an ongoing thing. You will never be done with documentation. That's an important point, so I'm going to repeat it, just so nobody forgot it or missed it. You will never stop your documentation practice, meaning that you will get to a point where you have your service delivery documented, and then you will start from that point, and forevermore, as long as you're a service organization, you're going to rely on that documentation to do what you do. And you're going to constantly refine that documentation to make what you do even better. And as you evolve as an MSP, so does your documentation. If you develop new technologies, if you develop new automation, if you develop new methodologies or procedures for what you do as an MSP, those things, as they creep into your practice, must also necessarily creep into your documentation so that other people in the future can understand what you do, how you do it, and you can train them more effectively, more quickly, and so on. So how do you start doing this? Well, start with a core set of documents. And it's not so much the documents because I'll tell you right now, I look at documentation all the time. This is what we do. You know, the MSP Verify process, we see documentation from MSPs all day. And I can tell you that I've seen an information security or an InfoSec policy so many times, and they all look different, meaning they all have different things in them. And so the important thing is that you don't want to start off with, I need to borrow an MSP's InfoSec policy and use it for my own. If you do, I'd be surprised because you probably do things very differently than the other MSP that you borrowed the document from. But it's a starting off point, and I accept that. So if let's say you borrowed someone else's homework. So you take your best buddy has an MSP practice just like you do. You ask them for a copy of their InfoSec policy. You take it. You should start chopping it down. Maybe you start adding to it. But it has to match what you do. And so what you're going to start to do is to create a set of documents that will mirror as closely as possible what you do. That's the initial goal. And that goal may take you some time. It's not going to happen overnight. But you'll need probably an information security policy. You'll need, and again, this may or may not exist in any given InfoSec policy, but I'm just talking about the fundamentals here, right? So you need some information security, stuff, right? Access management, third-party or vendor access management, risk management, password management, user access hierarchy, role-based access, right, is a very common thing. Encryption, backups, your methodology for assessing vendors, not just how you onboard and assess those vendor relationships that you develop, but also their access, if any, to your environment or customer environment, specifically customer data that you are responsible for. How do you safely monitor and review third-party access of that type? Not just physical, remote access as well. Those things ought to be like really critical core elements of any documentation. And you start there. And if you don't know what to call the document, leave it blank. Leave the title of that document blank. Call it, my MSP's documentation policy. Start with one and put everything in it. And then pretty soon, guess what? You're going to figure out, hey, well, we're seeing a theme here. These three areas are clumped together, have the same concept. So these are all related to access management. So let's group them over here. And this one over here is more like a business continuity. So maybe we'll have a business continuity policy document over here. So we create a second document. You'll start to figure the stuff out as you go along. Now, a common thing we get asked is, where do we put it? Well, I just gave you one example. You come up with a Word document, Google document, some document, any document. Make sure it's secure. Make sure you have access controls over who has access to it, who's responsible for it, who is responsible for creating it, for reviewing it, for implementing the things that are in it. Those things will come along. I'll tell you, I've seen a lot of MSPs who use the native knowledge base in their ticketing platforms or RMM platforms, right? So if you're a ConnectWise user, for example, ConnectWise knowledge base is a very common repository for this type of thing. It can be used not only for MSP documentation, policy documentation. It can also be used quite effectively for, some people call it an MSP runbook. Lots of different names for it, but it's a location that is commonly used, and because it's commonly used, it's more likely that your documentation project will become successful. If you make it difficult to use, guess what? It's probably not going to be as easy as you thought to get this thing off the ground and completed. If you're in the other camp, maybe you're a Kaseya user, or maybe you use IT Glue. IT Glue is a fantastic place. Those aren't the only two. I'm just giving you two examples. There are quite a few others. A lot of MSPs use SharePoint, OneDrive, also very common. Wherever you put it, doesn't matter. Wherever you put it, start with the concept that you're not going to finish it overnight. You're not going to finish it in 1 week. You're going to start the process, and it's going to continually evolve. If you are saying, great, well, you gave me the InfoSec, you gave me business continuity, what else? Certainly there's a lot of other MSP documentation topics that you should follow. Absolutely. I'll give you a couple of great examples. Since I'm talking predominantly to MSPs here, a great example would be the MSP Verify. If you want to even if you're not in the program. I'll drop a link in the show notes, mspalliance.com/UCS, and you can find our published standard there. That's the standard that is used in the MSP Verify certification and audit. And what you can do is you can take, there are 10 objectives, and the 10 objectives on that page will actually list, some of them, I think all of them list where there are documentation or policy requirements. And you can take that and use that as a very good checklist of what you ought to have. Now, some of you may be saying, well, I've been hearing a lot about NIST and the CMMC, and I hear about HIPAA and or ISO. All of them have, to some degree or another, some policy requirements, some policy documentation requirements. That's fine. If you're an MSP and you use MSP Verify, you will meet those other standards because our standard maps to those other standards. So you can rest assured that if you're a practicing MSP and you want a good place to start with the MSP Verify standard. Use that as a benchmark for what documentation policies you ought to have. Create a document called that thing, and go for it. And here's another tip. Most people say, I hear them say it because they tell me, we never really started because we thought, it's going to be such a time-consuming process that I just never started it, right? It's like one of those things where you look at the mountain of work you have to do and you never get started because it just looks insurmountable. Well, that's where a little bit of project management and a little sleight of hand comes in handy. Start small. If you want to start with an InfoSec policy, start title, InfoSec policy for my MSP practice, number 1. Every MSP does this, so everybody can start with this area. User onboarding, internal user onboarding. How do you onboard a user in your MSP organization specific to service delivery, but should include everybody? How do you bring that user onto your system, onto your network, onto your domain? Everybody's got a checklist. Written down or not, that depends. But every MSP that I've ever talked to has a methodology for doing that. Start there. Write it down. If you can only come up with 3 things that you remember offhand, write those 3 things down. Hit save. Get on with your day. By the end of the day, I guarantee if you're paying attention, you will have come up with probably 3 or 4 or 5 other elements that are all unique to how you onboard people. Guess what? You're on your way to developing an information security policy that is documented, and it's the beginning of your journey towards becoming safer, more secure, and a hell of a lot more scalable than you used to be. I hope this helps. We'll talk a lot more about this. I'll include some reference links in the show notes. It's so important, guys and girls. It's so important that you effectively document what you do, because I can't tell you how big of a difference it is in the morale, the corporate health, the efficiency, scalability, security, all of that. Everything gets better. It gets easier. It really does get a lot easier. The more you document, life just becomes a little bit simpler every day. And I look at the MSPs that don't have that, and they struggle. They know inherently something is not right. Things are a challenge to do that ought not to be a challenge, or they see other MSPs and they wonder why do they look differently, right? Why are they looking happy, or why do they say that they have a much easier time doing the things that I want to do? Chances are, it all comes down to documentation. Hope this helps. Until next time.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a like. Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast so you will get notified when future episodes are released. We will see you next time in the MSP Zone.